I just want to finish up a few odds and ends about amphibian reproduction before we go on and get started with reptiles. And as I mentioned before, many salamanders have internal fertilization. And unfortunately, I was having some technical difficulties with the video link working. It'd probably be nice to go ahead and show you this video, which I think is pretty spectacular for actually showing fertilization. This is plectodontid and plectodont germinal. It's found in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, actually, it's the female that's on top here. And notice there's a lot of close contact between the male and the female. And you can see these waves in the tail of the male undulating. And then if you look very closely right here, you can see the male depositing that sort of floppy looking spermatophore. And also notice how large the cloacal region of the male is because of that cloaca gland that actually makes the spermatophore. Okay? So the spermatophore is right there. And somehow the female is very clever for backing up over this, opening up the cloaca, and voila, you have internal fertilization without a copulatory organ in the males. Okay? Do all extant amphibia lack copulatory organs? Who says yes? Raise your hand. Who says no? Raise your hand. Okay, if no, then where are they present? Give me an example. Right? So in many of the Sicilians, male copulatory organs. Anything else?
Did it escape this tail?
The tailed frog also has internal fertilization via the copulatory organ. A lot of stuff goes on within the frogs. Again, they have the lion's share of diversity of extant amphibians. And I just wanted to highlight the behavior of a particular group of frogs, the dendrobated frogs, also known as the poison arrow or poison dart frogs. They have a highly toxic skin. They're found in the Neotropics. And this is not an exhaustive tabular summary of everything that goes on in that group, but note that just for 5 species, if you look at whether it's the males or the females, depending on the territory, tending to the eggs, who's carrying the tadpoles, who approaches whom, it's all over the place, which I just think is a wonderful example of the different roles that the sexes play, just depending on the species. So it's not as if in this group you sort of have some behaviors that are just hardwired to one sex, and then that's retained throughout the lineage. For reasons that I think are still far from clear, there's an awful lot of plasticity in an evolutionary sense for what goes on within this group, which commonly has spectacular amounts of parental care. And I thought you'd like to see a little video that illustrates that quite nicely.
In the rainforests of South America, the daily rains create a multitude of tiny pools in the center of many plants. This tiny poison arrow frog is carrying his tadpole paperback. It hangs
So look,
on,
this is the
and
male.
now he's taking it to a pool in a bromeliad, high up in the branches. The tadpole wriggles off. He may have half a dozen babies, each of which he puts into its own tiny pool. He makes regular tours of all his nurseries, checking on his tadpole's welfare.
So once again, parental care by the male, not the female.
This youngster is hungry and tells himself by nibbling his legs and vibrating against his body. But the male can't feed the tadpole himself. He needs help. He has to find a female. There she is. He calls.
So this is a very interesting use of vocalization because it's not being used to mate, but it is being used to provide parental care.
He has to leave, for only he knows exactly where he deposited each tadpole.
It's really a very complex task given that the male.
Female encouragingly. Tree jumps in, perhaps to assess the situation. Out she comes, without having done what's required, so he keeps calling. In she goes a second time. This time, she produces food for the hungry tadpole, an infertile egg. There. Out she comes, and mother and father embrace. Baby has its dinner.
There you can see the egg left by the female, but remarkably enough, the infertile egg is actually used to provide nutrition for young developing in the week. Okay? So I think that's one of the coolest examples. And again, if you think of this table, and I do not want you to worry about remembering the table, I do want you to remember the punchline that you can have a highly variable role for either the male or the female for different aspects of courtship and reproduction. And exactly what happens, not too surprisingly, depends on a particular evolutionary lineage to which a particular species belongs. Okay? All right, let's have you close your books. Get out a piece of paper. Print your name and the date and the names of all orders of extant reptiles.
How did you say reptiles?
Reptiles. Whatever the heck a reptile is,
The orders, you said?
all orders of extant reptiles. Don't worry, I mean, no, put on it, it's fine. All I'm worried about is a list of all orders of extant reptiles. Wrap this up in about a half minute or so. Okay, pass the papers to turn on. I'm just gonna do this one as extra credit. 1 point for your name, 1 point for the date, 1 point for each correct.
Oh, I forgot the dates. Oh, goodness.
Oh!
Goodness gracious, I swear. What's even the day today? I wouldn't even. Jesus Christ.
Not a big deal, okay? 1 point's not gonna make. Oh my goodness. Well, let's try this. Jot down some ideas. 1 minute. And even though we're sort of marching through group by group in this class, a key thing that should be happening as we go is that you're comparing things. We're doing comparative biology. I think that's where things get really interesting, is for all these groups of vertebrates, we're dealing with a bunch of tasks they must accomplish. Do they all do things the same way? Do they do things differently, and so on? Okay, who can give us something?
The skin constantly needs moisture.
Okay, that's potentially a big problem in a completely terrestrial environment. Someone else, something else. Yes.
The eggs have to have their own water source. Like
Okay.
They do have.
So to a major extent, reproduction is wedded to water, and the type of the egg is such that the egg at least needs an awful lot of moisture, if not standing water. And did you have another thing?
I was gonna basically say parental care.
What about parental care?
Like if, like what she's saying, if we happen to lay eggs outside of the water,
Okay.
basically it comes down to like predators as well. We could take that into consideration.
Okay, what's sort of another key thing having to do with reproduction? Before you even get to the stage of parental care, what must occur? Fertilization must occur, and how is that accomplished? Yeah, but in a bunch of amphibians, pardon me?
External fertilization.
Yeah, is that gonna work very well out of water? Not especially. So even though a bunch of amphibians do have internal fertilization, presumably the ancestral condition is external fertilization, where both eggs and sperm are released into water. You don't have water, you've got a major, major problem. Anything else? Kind of overlaps a little bit with what was mentioned earlier.
Like maybe like the early stages of life, like how they're like tadpoles and froglets, like they need to be in water, I guess, most of the time.
Okay, those early life stages for many amphibians are wedded to water. It's not just the eggs. Anything else?
Are you talking about like the breathing?
Oh, what about breathing?
Go through the skin, that's why you gotta keep it wet too.
Okay, and again, unfortunately, I find breathing a rather imprecise term. It sort of tends to lump a whole bunch of things together. So let's get pretty specific and think of ventilation and gas exchange, okay? Because some very different things go on for ventilation versus gas exchange, because gas exchange, of course, is based on molecular level of movement and the process of diffusion, okay? And for a lot of amphibians, as was mentioned, they have a permeable skin. The skin is not just permeable to water, the skin is commonly permeable to gases, and if some gas exchange can occur there, of course, then the skin has to be wet for that to be accomplished. And in fact, all gas exchange surfaces of all vertebrates are actually wet, whether they're internal or external structures. Okay? So the drier the environment gets, potentially, the more problematic things become for water loss during gas exchange, right? So some things have to get tweaked in order to lead a more terrestrial existence. And arguably, one of the differences between reptiles and amphibians is that they are, on average, more terrestrial. Reptiles are an amniote. What other classes of vertebrates are amniotes?
Mammals and avians.
Mammalia, eggs, and just polish it off with, we're focused now on reptilia, okay? And focus on some of these transitions that occur from an amphibian to an amniote. And the one biggie is actually with respect to reproduction, namely the structures that surround the developing young, the type of the egg. So you should certainly be able to sketch the embryonic membranes that are characteristic of amniotes. So remember, amniotes not only refers to those three classes, is amniotes, amniota, a monophyletic group? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hand. Okay. Why are amniotes not monophyletic?
It's, I guess, well, it's like skipping groups in between, like,
Skipping who?
um,
If we've got reptiles, birds, and mammals, who got skipped?
I guess not, like, yeah. It is what it
Okay, so we've got yet another, think of how huge the clade Gnathostomata was for jawed vertebrates. Here we've got another massive clade that includes more than one vertebrate class. And historically, some of the big divisions within amniotes are based on the type of skulls. Some of that has fallen out of favor more recently than in years past. Nonetheless, there are some distinct types of skulls, but not all of these types of skulls actually define clades. Pretty good consensus on that. And you should certainly know all orders of reptiles and all suborders of reptiles that were provided in class and on your handouts. And I certainly don't worry about you remembering precisely how many extant species there are in any of these groups, because Lord only knows they're finding new ones all the time and taxonomy is changing. But I definitely want you to have a sense of what group is most diverse, what's least diverse, so if you could at least rank them from most diverse to least diverse, because again, we find some tremendous disparities among equal taxonomic ranks with respect to how many extant species there are. Okay? And the biggie is, how does the skin differ in reptiles compared to amphibians? A key thing that's very pronounced in extant reptiles is that periodically they replace the outermost layer of the skin, and you should be able to explain how that works. And an easy way to explain how that works is to make a crude little sketch of the different layers of the skin, as shown on one of your handouts, to explain this process of ecdysis, or shedding the skin. Okay, so let's think of first what characterizes the clade amniota, amniotic egg. Okay? And the amniotic egg is recognized based on the arrangement of three key membranes. So if this is our little developing vertebrate with the head over at the right, the body at the left, emerging from its belly is a yolk sac to provide nutrition. And then there's a membrane referred to as the elentos, and that emerges right next to where the yolk sac comes out of the belly. And again, precisely how big this is, it depends on the developmental stage and the taxonomic group and everything else. And this membrane is involved in dealing with wastes as well as in the process of gas exchange. And then the amniotic membrane is the membrane that sort of most immediately surrounds the embryo. And there's another membrane, the chorion, that's pretty doggone complicated. So, as I'm showing diagrammatically here, the chorion sort of closely wraps around all this other stuff. But then there's a space between all that stuff that it wraps around and the outermost region of the chorionic membrane. Okay? Now, there's quite a misnomer out there. You can still find a lot of sources on the web and old textbooks and so on that refer to the amniotic egg as the land egg. Well, certainly it's less reliant on water than the eggs of amphibians. But the key thing is, it's how these membranes are arranged. And how important do you think the amniotic membrane is for preventing desiccation?
Pretty important. Doesn't like suspend the.
Who says it's important? Who says it's not so important? Where is water going to get lost to the environment? Where is the external environment?
Outside the bone.
So does the amniotic membrane come in contact with the external environment?
No.
No, okay, so probably not too important for preventing desiccation to a surrounding dry environment. Instead, where the action really is a little bit in the chorion, but mostly in the nature of the shell. So you're probably aware that, if you crack open an egg, you see that chorionic membrane often, if you have hard-boiled eggs, right, and you peel the shell off of hard-boiled eggs, a lot of times it kind of gets stuck to that membrane before you get to the good stuff, okay? That's the chorionic membrane. But even outside of the chorionic membrane, you have different types of egg shells. Different types of those egg shells have varying degrees of calcification, and the extent to which water is lost by the egg depends largely on the structure of that outermost layer of the egg, namely the shell or the shell membrane. And this is something that's incredibly variable within extant reptiles. You're well aware that bird eggs do a very good job of not losing water. But perhaps you're not aware that the eggs of many extant reptiles have leathery shells that are highly permeable to water. And in fact, a big frustrating problem in captivity is if you have a captive snake and it lays eggs, they may actually dry out and die overnight, depending on the species of snake and how dry the surrounding environment is. And a great many reptilian eggs, obviously if the shell is permeable to water, water can go both ways. Many reptile eggs have increased mass after laying because they'll actually absorb water from the surrounding environment. Now, I want you to think back to amphibian reproduction and the pletodontid salamanders. So remarkably enough, there are actually some amphibians that do almost as good a job as some reptiles with respect to eggs and what sort of moisture levels they can or cannot tolerate, okay? But there's a ton of variation within extant reptiles. But if you had to make a guess, most reptiles have these leathery eggs that in fact are permeable to water, okay? And you've got who an amniote is on handout 12, I believe that's page 1, handout 12, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay. We've got a phylogeny there as well as the taxa, and as we've already mentioned, the amniotes are a clade, and there are 3 classes nested within the amniotes: Reptilia, Aves, and Mammalia. Okay. Is class Reptilia monophyletic? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. Well, why not?
Birds.
Well, what about birds?
They're more like food.
Okay, well, let's pretend birds didn't exist then. Does that solve the problem? Somebody else? If birds didn't exist, would class Reptilia be monophyletic? Who says yes, raise your hands. Who says no, raise your hands. Well, why not? I'm glad you're getting the no, but let's have the attendant explanation, okay?
Mammals.
What about them?
Mammals are also in reptiles.
Well, they're sort of nested within.
Yeah, like they
Okay.
live, but not the.
Okay, so Reptilia is a what group? Polyphyletic. It's more than one thing missing. It's not just one thing that's missing. Okay? Let's consider some of the major structural variation in the skull found within the amniotes. And you have these very schematic diagrams on page 2 of handout 12, so make sure you have that available for quick reference, so you can just add some labels to that unlabeled diagram on your handout. Synapses lack holes in the head behind the orbit where the eyeball is. Synapses on one side of the head have one major opening, and diapsids have two major openings on one side of the head behind the orbit. At least the ancestral condition for diapsids has that configuration. So, admittedly, these are very schematic diagrams, so I certainly would not expect you to be able to sketch something more elaborate than this, as long as you get the spatial relationships right. That's great. So this would be a left lateral view. The white dot is the orbit where the eyeball is. And what bone would be running along the mid-dorsal line and go all the way to the back of the skull? The parietal bone. Very good. And then what bone is behind the orbit? Yeah, that's too easy, isn't it? Some of these names do actually make sense. And then what abuts with the parietal bone and is posterior to the postorbital? The occipital is more medial than this one. So this is if you're looking at the side of the head. How about our friend the squamosal bone? Okay? And along the margin of the upper jaw, and also making contact with the orbit, is the what bone? The dugal bone. And then at the posterior lateral margin of the skull is the quadratodugal. Okay? So you're going to see this is sort of what a turtle skull looks like. And views on turtle skulls have actually changed radically over the past several years. Current thinking is that the ancestors of turtles actually had a couple of openings behind the orbit that were secondarily lost. An older view that's largely discarded, not completely discarded by everyone. That's why there's still a lot of squabbling where turtles go in reptile phylogeny, is that this condition preceded the diapsid condition. But that's pretty much an outdated view at this point in time. Okay? Now here's a sketch of the synapsid skull. What's this? The parietal. What's this? What's this? Squamosal. What's this? The jugal. And what's this? Quadratodugal. Okay? So the key thing about synapsids is there's this fenestrum or hole behind the orbit, surrounded by three bones, the postorbital, the jugal, and the squamosal. Notice that the quadratojugal does not make contact with the margins of that opening. It's just these three bones. Okay? Now let's look at the ancestral conditions for diapsids. What's this bone? The parietal. What's this one? Postorbital. What's this one? What's this one?
Jugal.
And what's this one?
Jugal.
Okay. So you've got two holes, two fenestra. The more dorsal one is surrounded by the parietal, postorbital, and squamosal. And the more ventral and lateral one is surrounded by the postorbital, the squamosal, and the jugal. Notice that's what we have over here too. Okay? In some groups, the quadratojugal comes really close to the margins of that opening. But one thing you can say without fail is that these three actually surround it very clearly. For the skulls that you have in lab, a bunch of them belong to the clade Diopsida, but they no longer have all of these openings. What are two examples that you've seen in lab that actually have these two openings? Or have you had the skulls in lab, or just the, yeah, I thought Olivia was putting skulls out for you.
Crocodiles and gators.
Okay, and that's what order?
Crocodilia.
The order Crocodilia. Okay? They've got those two openings. And then what's another order where both of those are present?
Is it the Squamate?
Well, no. Because bones got lost in the most recent common ancestor of squamates. So for extant squamates, no. Okay, so remember our little buddy, the tuatara, Rhynchocephalia is the order. And that is the sister group to what order? Squamata. So the Lepidosauria includes the tuatara plus the squamates. And one of the reasons why tuataras are so cool is that they're in that lineage that gave rise to squamates, and they retain ancestral conditions. So make sure you really take a good look at that tuatara skull. It's not a real one, it's a model. It's a highly endangered species, as I'm sure you're aware. So what are some types of squamate reptiles? Lizards. Okay. So here's a schematic view of a lizard skull. And what's this?
Right.
Yep. And then what is this? Well, what's this? Which one of these two bones is most posterior to the orbit and contacts the orbit? The bigger one, yeah. Okay. So this annoying little bone is actually the postfrontal. The frontal bone is anterior to the parietal bone. Okay? And then what's this bone? Well, here's this dorsal fenestrum,
be.
Is that like, is the one to, is that tiny little one? Like a
Don't worry about the tiny little one. Because that one's really annoying. So what above abuts to the post-orbital and the dorsal venestrum? The squamosal, okay? So it's still fundamentally in the same position. And then there's sort of annoying supratemporal bone. And I must confess, I get pretty confused. Depending on the reference you go, the name of this bone kind of wiggles around all over the place. So sort of be forewarned on that. And then you've got the dual bone, which is along that posterior ventral margin of the orbit. The quadratodugal has been lost. And because that's been lost, and because the squamosal bone has been modified, you no longer have a second opening surrounded by bone. Okay? Snakes have lost even more stuff. So they don't have either one of those fenestra in the skull anymore, even though they belong to the diapsida. Okay? So remember, this is the ancestral condition for diapsids, but there have been some losses of those structures that define what the diapsid skull looks like. So snakes have a post-orbital bone still, posterior to the orbit, and a supratemporal bone that articulates with the parietal bone. Okay? And then the quadrate bone of snakes articulates to the supratemporal bone. So interestingly, you've got a whole lineage of reptiles where a bunch of stuff gets lost. Yes?
Is that little tiny thing post-orbital in snakes? Or
Yeah, a little wedgie. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
it's where that prefrontal or postfrontal was in the lizard, kind of?
Well, or you can just say it's really about where the post-orbital was in the lizards. Okay?
And you said there was.
But its shape has changed a bit. Okay? So the key thing to focus on is kind of how these openings that ancestrally were surrounded by bone get lost progressively in the lineage that leads to snakes. So snakes and lizards have modified diapsid skulls rather than retaining the ancestral condition. That makes sense to everybody? Okay? And that has some important consequences for what those various heads can do. Okay. So within class Reptilia, how many extant orders are there? 4. So let's do it this way. Who says 1? Raise your hand. Who says 2? Raise your hand. 3. Going once. Going twice. Do we have any 3s? We got some 3s. Do we have any 4s? Going once. Going twice. Do we have any 5s? No 5s? Okay. 4. What are they? Give me 1.
Crocodilia. Is crocodilia one?
Crocodilia sure is. Next row, give me 1 more. Squamata. And what's a common name for squamata of some of the critters within squamata?
I guess like lizards and snakes.
It's mostly lizards and snakes. Okay, can you give me another one?
Sphenodon.
Or Rhynchocephalia. Okay, Sphenodon is the genus. Okay. Unfortunately, the name flip-flops back and forth between Sphenodon and Rhynchocephalia. So they make you pick. And let's see. Can you give me another one?
Amphibians.
Yep. Okay. Very good. So turtles are monophyletic, something less than 300 living species. Crocodilians are a very old lineage they used to be way more diverse than they are now. There are only about a couple dozen living species. So these are alligators, crocodiles, gharial, and caiman. Okay? And then Scenodontia or Rhynchosphalia, depending on the reference that you read. And again, depending on the reference you read, either one or two species. Again, a group that has been pretty darn diverse and is nearly extinct. I think it's so cool that there's just one or two species left. They live in New Zealand. They're really strange animals. I encourage you, just for fun, to read up a little bit on tuatars. They're very, very odd indeed. And actually quite long-lived for a reptile. And then squamates. And within the squamates, you have the suborder Amphibiania, and those are specialized burrowers. And there's only one genus that has forelimbs, all the others are limbless, and they no longer have image-forming eyes. And many of them no longer even have any pigment. So they're really, really specialized burrowers. Yeah?
How come like every single bird always has a thing that looks like a worm?
Well, that's interesting to ponder, isn't it? And when we get into locomotion, we'll deal with that a little bit more. There are just many circumstances in which legs actually encumber an animal rather than being helpful. So if you're actually pushing through mud, pushing through soil, it's pretty tough to be streamlined if you've got legs sticking out of the side, okay? So it seems there's a pretty severe selection pressure to lose those legs in order to move either through burrows, make burrows, or perhaps even just through very confined circumstances. Okay? And then the suborder Lacertilia, lizards, has something over 6,000 living species. And I must confess, one of my favorite groups, suborder Serpentes. That should be an easy one to remember. Serpents, same thing as snakes, right? And somewhere around 3,400 to 3,500 living species. Okay? Are the Amphibians monophyletic? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. Okay, so all of you voting are voting no. Why are they not monophyletic? Well, let's put it this way. They're not monophyletic. They are monophyletic. Okay. How about Lacertilia? Are the lizards monophyletic? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. Kind of a split verdict. Again, we'll go with the naysayers. If you say no, why not? Look at your handout.
Probably not.
You've got a cladogram on your handouts, right? It's not monophyletic because it excludes snakes in Amphibians. So that's not a typographical error on your handout. I very deliberately drew a couple of branches for Lacertilia to reinforce that Lacertilia is not monophyletic, whereas snakes are monophyletic. So those are some of the higher level facts to keep in mind when you're talking about the biology of reptiles, with an emphasis on the biology of extant reptiles. Now, you've got a pretty comprehensive handout on reptile skin, how it's built, and how it's replaced. So you can just kind of follow along on the handout. Again, if we think and paint with broad brush strokes, arguably reptilian skin is less permeable to water than amphibian skin. Reptilian skin has scales. Now, those scales are not like fish scales. They're not embedded bony plates, but rather reptilian scales are actually just folds in the skin. And in contrast to amphibians, the skin of reptiles generally has very few glands in it. And the skin of reptiles, of course, is perfectly dry because there are no mucus glands secreting mucus that covers the skin to keep it moist, among other things. And in some reptiles, you actually get the formation of little bony plates in the skin, known as osteoderms. And the outermost layer of reptilian skin is dead keratin, and it's renewed via the process of ecdysis. In a lot of the squamate reptiles, big chunks of the skin come off simultaneously, whereas in turtles and crocodilians, you may have a little bit replaced here, a little bit replaced there, rather than everything mostly happening at one time. Okay. And here's a very diagrammatic illustration of a cross-section through the skin, as is shown on page 3 of your handout, but that is unlabeled on your handout, so make sure you do get that labeled. Right along here is a membrane to which these cuboidal living cells are attached. And so this is the outermost surface of the skin. This is the innermost surface of the skin. So this is known to imaginatively called the basement membrane because it's below all that stuff. And then this cellular layer attached to the basement membrane has cells that can divide and produce other cells. So if you think of germinating seeds, this is referred to as the stratum, which simply means layer. And it's the layer that gives rise to additional cells that make up the stratum intermedium. So here we see cells, they have rather different shape, but then this outermost layer of the skin is acellular. And as I've mentioned, this is keratinized. And horny, that root word here refers to sort of horn or horny-like. And if you think of what your fingernails are like, that's the same protein that makes up this outermost layer of the skin. And then in some cases, you'll see this very, very top layer that often has some sculpturing to it, referred to by the old German word. Over means above or outside of. In German, Haut means skin. So this very outermost layer is often referred to as the Oberhaupten layer of the skin. And your handout goes into the details of how the skin is replaced. In a nutshell, these cells give rise to additional cells. And once those new cells are produced, in between these existing stratum intermedium cells and stratum germinativum, those old stratum intermedium cells sort of die. And then you get an acellular layer that is new underneath that old acellular layer. And then that oldest acellular layer is sloughed off. Okay, it's pretty much that simple. So it's renewed from inside out, and before that dead acellular layer is shed, a new acellular layer is produced. Okay? And it's pretty fun watching critters shed their entire skin. And snakes sometimes manage to do it in one piece. Okay? So lots of differences between reptiles and amphibians, and this outermost structure that's in this intimate contact with the environment and has some profound consequences for water loss, that where a lot of the action is, but not all of the action, is how heavily keratinized that is, but also some recent work has found that the composition and concentration of lipids in the skin of reptiles is also important for determining the rates of water loss. I will not be seeing you again until Wednesday. We've got reading days, I believe Monday and Tuesday, is that not correct? So then you won't have lab next week, but then the week following that. Okay?
That's practical week, right? The one after? Or is it-
Have you had both reptile labs yet?
Yeah, we have a review you set up, so.
This week.
Oh, so you
Next
already,
week,
I
yeah.
lost track. You already had both reptile labs?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, yeah, so then, yeah, look at the syllabus for all those dates. I'm sorry to spaced out on that. Stay on top of that stuff, more so than me, please.